Now, let me ask you a question. Do you ever talk to yourself? How many of you talk to yourself? Raise your hand. How many of you do not talk to yourself? Raise your hand. Sorry, Elizabeth. Elizabeth appeared to be the only one. Yeah, I was walking down the street the other day, and I was talking to myself, but I was talking internally. I wasn't speaking out loud, but I was still talking to myself. And then all of a sudden, I sensed, because I heard behind me a fella talking to himself out loud, loudly, making very little sense. You know, kind of like Sean did just a few minutes ago. I'm not going to get off of it. I just keep going once it's a chance. So, no, and I heard this fella talking very loudly, and at first I thought, he's crazy. And then I thought, he's doing the exact same thing I'm doing. The only difference is the volume. That's the only difference between him and me. I think almost all of us talk to ourselves. So if you see me talking to myself, I'm having a staff meeting. And I just want to go ahead and explain that right now, because it's likely at some time or another you might see me talking to myself. Some people think that talking to yourself is a sign that you are going crazy. Did you know actually research has shown it's the exact opposite? That's the truth. Research has shown it is the exact opposite. An experiment, people were given a stack of 20 pictures and were told to find in this picture a banana. Half of them were told to keep their lips sealed, don't talk to themselves, don't say anything out loud at all. The other half could repeat out loud anything they wanted to say and were to talk about what they were looking for if they wanted to. The half that talked out loud found the banana far faster. Of course, I guess you could make the argument that means talking to yourself makes you go bananas faster. I don't know. But my guess is we all talk to ourselves, either silently or out loud. So how you talk to yourself, that becomes the issue. And especially how you talk to yourself when you're discouraged. How you talk to yourself when you're downhearted. How you talk to yourself when things have not gone exactly right. Do you ever talk to yourself by saying, this is the worst thing that could ever possibly happen? I'm such a failure. Poor, pitiful me. I never get a break. Things always seem to be going poorly for me. Talking to yourself that way perpetuates the discouragement. And here's a fascinating Bible verse. It's in 1 Samuel 30, verse 6. And you remember this is after Saul has driven young David, he's a teenager, out of the palace because he's jealous of him because of his victory over Goliath. And he's so jealous, and he gets more envious all the time because the people are singing. They're saying, you know, Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his tens of thousands. And he drives him from the palace, and he spends years on the run from Saul. And Saul has his troops chasing after him, trying literally to kill him. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and daughters. And then comes this interesting line. He was greatly distressed, and then he encouraged himself in the Lord. But David encouraged himself in the Lord. Did you get that? They're out to kill him. They're bitter toward him. He's greatly distressed. I hope nobody's been out to kill you, but I know everybody in here at some time or another has been greatly distressed or greatly depressed. Have you ever been greatly distressed because it seemed like people didn't like you? It seemed like people were out to get you? It seemed like everything was going wrong? How do you handle that? What do you say to yourself then? Here's what David did. He encouraged himself in the Lord his God. I am telling you right now, there have been times in my life I have felt lower than a snake. And I knew that for me to get better and for my situation to get better, I must encourage myself in the Lord and find strength in the Lord. If you've listened to any of my messages through the years, you know how often I talk about community, about family, about fellowship, about the church, about being there for one another, about the one another scriptures. I talk about that probably as much as I talk about any other subject. And it's true that we have to be there for one another. But it's also equally true that sometimes you have to be there for you. Sometimes you have to be there for you. David is out here alone. They're trying to kill him. He's distressed, discouraged, depressed. And he encouraged himself in the Lord. At that moment, it wasn't about his past and his shepherding and his brothers and his family. At that moment, it wasn't about his future as Israel's greatest king and to reign over Israel's greatest history. At that moment, it was about right now, and I have got to encourage not others, but myself. Because ultimately, if you don't encourage yourself, you're not able to encourage others either. Because ultimately, if you encourage yourself, you and God make a majority. You're better off with God only on your side than you are with everybody else in the whole world on your side and God not on your side. So we've got to learn how to encourage ourselves in the Lord our God. Let's think about quickly some ways we can do that. I think one of the best ways you can possibly do that is remind yourself of all that God has done for you. One of the reasons I think we should read the Bible is to be reminded of how God has a history of being faithful to his people. Sometimes when I've talked to people in counseling who are so down and they're distressed, like David was at this moment, I'll say, let's do this. What was the happiest moment of your life? What was the happiest time you ever remember in your life? And I'll get them back on something that was the happiest thing they remember. And then I'll say, well, give me another one. Well, give me a third one. Well, take yourself there right now. Go back to that moment. What was the time God worked in your life? What was the time that God answered a prayer in your life? And I'll have them give it to me and I'll say, well, go back to that moment right now. And I'm suggesting to them what I'm suggesting to you right now. Remind yourself of all that God has done for you. That's one of the ways you can encourage yourself in the Lord. The Bible gives us a number of examples of that. David said, I remember the days of old. I ponder all your great works and think about what you have done. And there's not a person in this room that has been a faithful Christian that cannot write those same words. Every one of us have moments where we could say, I remember the days of old when the Lord ministered to me and blessed me. I ponder all the great works about what he has done for me. I will exalt you, Lord, for you rescued me. Has the Lord ever rescued you? Bring that back to your memory when you're talking to yourself and you're discouraged or downhearted. Bring back to your memory a time when the Lord rescued you. You refused to let my enemies triumph over me. Have you ever been blessed by the Lord to triumph over an enemy? Bring that memory back to you so that you can encourage yourself in the Lord. Oh, Lord my God, I cried to you for help and you restored my help. Have you ever been so heartfelt that you cried in prayer? I have many times. Many times. Bring back that memory of how God rebounded you from that. David wrote, I prayed to the Lord and he answered me. He freed me from all my fears. Those who look to him for help will be radiant with joy. There's the opposite of depressed, discouraged, and distressed. Those who look to him for help will be radiant with joy. No shadow of shame will darken their faces. In my desperation, I prayed and the Lord listened. Remind yourself of that regularly. I waited patiently for the Lord to help me, and he turned to me and heard me cry. He lifted me out of the pit of despair and out of the mud and the mire and set my feet on solid ground and steadied me as I walked along. If you want to be, as we sometimes sing, standing on solid ground, you are going to have to remind yourself of the times the Lord put you there and how he allowed you to encourage yourself in the Lord. He has given me a new song to sing, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see what he has done and be amazed. They will put their trust in the Lord. One of the reasons David was able to encourage himself when everybody wanted to kill him was he remembered these things. And over the years when I've gotten a little down and needed to encourage myself in the Lord, I've had to remind myself of what the Lord has done for me. 19 years ago, this week, on Friday, on August the 25th, I had open heart surgery. 5 bypasses. I don't think they can do more than 6. 5 bypasses. And at that time, I was lower than a snake. And I was weaker than a snake. And I wondered if I would live, but I also wondered what my life would be like after I lived. And they told me, well, these new arteries that they are bypassing around, they usually last this amount of time and that amount of time, and I'm already past all those amounts of times, many years over. But I go back and remember how I felt then and how God has blessed me. This picture looks like me eating something I shouldn't be eating. That's not what it is at all. This picture was 13 years ago, next week. 13 years ago, next week, my oldest son, Scott, had a brain tumor and underwent an 8.5-hour surgery at Tampa General Hospital because no surgeon in Southwest Florida would touch it, even think about it. And about halfway through that surgery, I went down to the cafeteria. And in honor of Scott, I didn't really want it myself, honestly. Scott's favorite candy is Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. And so in honor of Scott, I ate 2 big Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. And someone took a picture of me doing it. But as I look at that picture, I'm reminded that we didn't know if he'd live, and we certainly didn't know if he would have nerve damage, paralysis, or all sorts of things. Thankfully, all he lost is hearing in one ear. But I reminded myself how God has provided, of what God has done for us. And many times I've had to remind myself of how God forgave me of some sin, or how God has blessed me when I didn't really deserve it. That's called grace. Or how God has rescued me. When you need to encourage yourself, take some time to think back on what God has done for you in the past. Write it down, pray about it, praise about it, and intentionally remind yourself of what God has done for you. And when you do that, you're actually obeying Philippians 4:8, which says you're always going to remember things, you're always going to think about things. So while you're thinking, think about things that are true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent and praiseworthy. Think about such things. You want to learn how to take care of you and encourage yourself. Remind yourself of all that God has done for you. And then remind yourself of all that God has done through you too. Remind yourself of all that God has done through you. Paul said, every time I think of you, I give thanks to God. Whenever I pray, I make my request for all of you with joy because you've been my partners in spreading the good news about Christ from the first time you heard about it until now. When I think about this church and I think about my years here, I always think positive, good, pleasant thought. I think exactly this. I could have written these words. This church has been a bright beacon. We are the largest church of Christ in the state of Florida, but numbers don't matter so much. What matters is influence and outreach and sustainability. What matters is praising God. And so I could say those same words myself when I think about how I've ministered with you and you have ministered with me. And so he went on in the same chapter and said, so it is right that I should feel as I do about all of you, for you have a special place in my heart. You share with me the special favor of God, both in my imprisonment and in defending and confirming the truth of the good news. God knows how much I love you and long for you with the tender compassion of Jesus Christ. Paul wrote to Philemon, your love has given me much joy and comfort, my brother, for your kindness has often refreshed the hearts of God's people. David reminded himself over and over and over again how God had used him to help the people, beginning with the defeat of Goliath. You too have been used as a blessing to somebody. God has used you to strengthen somebody else and to further his kingdom. Remind yourself whenever you're down of somebody you have helped. And if you can't think of anybody you have helped, for God's sake, get out there and help somebody. And that will give you a memory to look back on. And that will help you to encourage yourself. Sometimes when I need to encourage myself that I have been able to make a small difference in the lives of others, go out in my garage to a box. It's a box that I almost brought it. I thought about bringing it this morning, but it's got a lot of bugs in it and cobwebs and stuff, you know. It's about this wide, it's about this high, and it's every card and note and letter that people at the church have written me here for the last 40 years, isn't it? It stayed in my office a long time, stayed in the closet in my office for a long time. That's where it is now. And every now and then, I used to pull it out about once or twice a year. I hadn't pulled it out now in a long, long time, which I guess means maybe I'm finally mentally healthy a little bit. But anyway, every now and then I'll pull it out and I'll read through a handful of those, or maybe 2 or 3 handfuls of those, and it'll be exactly what I'm talking about now. Remind yourself of what God has done through you. That is what David did here. He encouraged himself in the Lord. Maybe you were instrumental one time in leading someone to Christ. Maybe you lended financial support to an individual or a church when it was desperate. Maybe you practically kept a church afloat financially when it was desperate. Maybe you used your spiritual gift to serve God and to serve others. In the moment when you need encouragement, remind yourself of how God has worked through you to minister to and encourage others. If you're like me, the more you think about how it happened in the past, the more you want to see it happen again in the future. And that will help you to encourage yourself in the Lord. I'm quite convinced that what happened with David in this text that I used this morning, I'm quite convinced that one of the ways David encouraged himself in the Lord is when he was down and distressed and on the run there, he thought back about how God had given him the victory over Goliath. How he had once stood up to the world champion warrior through the power in God and by faith. And that encouraged him to get back up and keep going. I told the teenagers this year in the VBS about 3 weeks ago, on one of the night services that I was teaching them, I taught on the prayer of the heart that night, and I told them the story that fits so well here. I just have to tell it again. I was, many years ago, I was in Nashville to speak all week at a Christian campground called, the name of it escapes me. Madison Church of Christ owned it. And there were 300 or 400 teenagers that would be there all week. And the worst, to me, a nightmare is speaking to 300 or 400 teenagers. I'm not a teenage speaker. I started out as a youth minister, but I'm not a teenage speaker. I've taught teenagers regularly in 45 years. And I don't know the vernacular. I don't know anything, really. And so it's always intimidating to me to go talk to teenagers. So I had prayed all morning. My prayer of the heart was this. All morning, my prayer of the heart was, Lord, I don't know what I'm doing. Help me to help somebody today. Help me to help somebody today. And sometimes I would actually insert, Lord, I don't know what I'm doing today. So, Lord, just help me to help somebody today. And I'm thinking the whole time about help one of the teenagers. If I just touched one teenager at camp, that's what I'm thinking the whole time. That's the whole goal and focus that I have. I got on the interstate, heading out toward Nashville. I was starting to get off at the Rivergate exit, which led up to the camp. And I got off the exit, and as I'm going up, I see a car coming down the wrong side of the interstate toward me. And I know those are how the worst accidents happen. We hear about those all the time where somebody probably drunk gets on the interstate going in the wrong direction, hits several cars, causes a big pile up, lots of people dead, lots of issues. So, I don't have much time to think. I do not have much time to think. And my prayer of the heart comes right back up to me that I'd already prayed 15, 20 times that morning. Lord, help me to help somebody today. Help me to help somebody today. And it hits me. Turn my car, completely block the road, and jump out as fast as I can. That's what I did. I turned my car, blocked the interstate, jumped out of the car as fast as I possibly could, and the car slowly then came down to me and stopped. Then I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know what I was running into. I didn't know what I was going to do at all. It could have been somebody with a gun. It could have been somebody drunk. It was somebody drunk. Really drunk. And I went over and to the windshield and I said, buddy, do you realize you're going the wrong way? And I didn't really realize that. I really appreciate you stopping me. And I just tried to keep him in place for a few minutes and hoped that somebody had called. And within about 4 or 5 minutes, the police showed up. Several police cars showed up and they handled it and moved. And I drove on to the camp realizing that my prayer of the heart had already come true before I got to the campground. That God had worked in my life already. And God had done something through me already. And that no matter what I did at the campground that day, what I did right then had been the answer to my prayer of the heart. Many times I've looked back over that and been encouraged myself over what God has done through me. And then you don't just look back. You don't just look inward, but you always look forward to what God has planned for you if you want to really encourage yourself. You think about what God has got left for me. That'll encourage you. Football fans will recognize the screen pretty quickly. Junior Seau was a guy who seemingly had everything going for him and everything to live for. He was one of the greatest defensive football players of all time, a member of the Hall of Fame, rich, tens of millions of dollars he made in the game, and then he had turned around and established foundations for people to help people. Millions of fans in the world of sports, loved and respected deeply in his hometown of San Diego. It seemed like he had everything to live for, but somehow he reached the point where he didn't think so. Somehow he reached the point where he saw no hope and no purpose, and he gave up. And he didn't think ahead to what God had prepared for him left when he got distressed, like David did. And he didn't encourage himself in the Lord. He gave up his very life. It stunned everybody that knew him. This great man had so much more to accomplish. God could have used him in so many more ways, but he couldn't see it. It's heartbreaking that he lost sight of all the good that he had yet to accomplish, all the potential that he still had to accomplish, in addition to all that he had accomplished in the past. That's always such a sad thought. Worse, even perhaps. I read another story about a young man named Dario Iacoponi. He was 15 years old, was so utterly brilliant. He attended one of the top private schools in the United Kingdom, and in his class were Tony Blair's two sons, and they were his friends. He was so advanced in his ability and in his studies that he was accepted at Harvard or Yale when he was 15. But he saw his life as meaningless. He weighed the pros and cons and decided on balance that life is not good, and the most reasonable option was to take it. He even presented and wrote out mathematical equations in support of the idea, asserting that the logic of his mathematical conclusions were indisputable. And he took his own life. Today, Dario would be in his 40s. And I can only imagine what marvelous contributions he would have made to the world since his life ended. This brilliant young man could have done great things with his life, but he couldn't see how to encourage himself in the Lord. Now, many people don't take that drastic step when they get discouraged, but they do take the drastic step of giving up on themselves and giving up on their dreams and just living, running out the clock. There have been a lot of times when I've been caught up in discouragement and I've had to remind myself, you may be struggling now, you may not be getting the results that you want right now, but God still has plans for you going forward. I love the old bumper sticker and the slogan, "Please be patient, God isn't finished with me yet." That's true. No matter who you are, if you're breathing and you're here today, when you're discouraged, you need to say the same thing to yourself. Be patient. God is not finished with me yet. You can't be finished with you because God is not finished with you. When you think that, remind yourself of Psalm 37, which says, "Commit everything you do to the Lord. Trust Him and He will help you. He will make your innocence radiate like the dawn, and the justice of your cause will shine like the noonday sun." Remember the last verse of the most familiar scripture in all the Word of God. "Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Discouragement is a serious thing. And it can have serious consequences. If you're discouraged, it's a good thing to talk to somebody. And it's also a good thing, if you're discouraged, to talk to yourself. But make sure you say the right things to yourself. And make sure, like David, you encourage yourself. Don't forget these last three words. In the Lord. He didn't say he encouraged himself with Norman Vincent Peale and positive thinking. He didn't, 1 Samuel 30 didn't say he encouraged himself by listening to Joel Osteen tell a few positive cliches. He didn't say that. He said encourage himself in the Lord. The key is to get into God's presence, get into God's word, listen to what God is saying to you, and the Lord's strength and encouragement will come to you. Sometimes, my friends, you are not crazy if you talk to yourself. Sometimes you are crazy if you don't. If you don't. So, learn how, when you talk to yourself, to, like David, encourage yourself in the Lord.